Well, let's get to our panel right now. Joining us here in Washington is social and political commentator Julianne Malveaux. Ron Martinelli is a forensic criminologist specializing in police practices. He spent 22 years as a police officer and detective and joins us via Skype from Texas. And Ray Baker is a journalist and political analyst. He is also with us here in the studio in Washington. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Ron, let me start with you. You've been a police officer, an investigator, and you've also been training policemen as well as people in the military. When you listen to what happened there in Minneapolis, what do you make of it?
Well, first of all, the theme so far from the media is trying to drive it towards a racial issue. That's how you began your program. There's no indications whatsoever that there's any racial component of this. Rather, we have to be able to reconcile the circumstances, facts, and forensic evidence from what the officers are saying in comparison to what we have, which is a dead civilian who was unarmed. So that is how the investigation should drive. It's unfortunate that the officers didn't have their body cameras activated, but I think we have to take a closer look at the policies of the department as to exactly when the body cameras get activated. Now, it's not reasonable to have officers have their body cameras on 24/7, because that would mean that they would have to record and store all of that information, which is extremely difficult and expensive to do. Rather, when they have contact with civilians, and especially under circumstances that might be suspicious or criminal in nature, or any time that force would be used, that's when the cameras need to go on and to forensically record what takes place.
But would this have been one of those circumstances?
Well, we don't know enough about the initial encounter. We do know the nature of the call, but Ms. Damon, initially is the reporting party and not a suspect in this case. What is troublesome so far is, number one, the police department has not revealed enough information, and the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension has not revealed enough information, even though there is some information out there that they could readily explain to the public. As a person that has investigated over 300 of these shootings and does independent review all over the nation, I can tell you for a fact that there are things that can be released to the public and the media that do not compromise the investigation. So I'm disappointed with that so far.
Julianne, the United States has an incredibly high rate of police killings. As we said in our introduction, more than 660 people shot and killed by police this year. We're only in July. Are police too quick to draw their weapons and use them?
I think absolutely they are. Not only too quick to draw their weapons and use them, but too slow to turn their body cameras on. After a number of police killings, police executions, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, we can call the roll of black men and women who were killed by white police officers, there has been a groundswell of saying, put your camera on. So with respect to the prior guest, what I would say is when you have gone into an alley, when someone has said there's a challenge, that's when you turn your camera on. The cameras were not turned on. The question then is, what do you have to hide? Second question I would raise, Anand, is the question about how we pair officers. Both of the officers were with about 2 years of experience. So they were relatively new officers. Why weren't they paired with someone who was senior? I mean, I think that, when we go back and unpeel this, I don't know what happened. I wasn't there. None of us do. Obviously, this is a tragedy for the young woman who was killed and a tragedy for the officer who killed her. But here's what we do know. We do know that experienced officers tend to be a little more slow your roll than new officers. So you have two people who've been on the force for 2 years. That seems to raise a flag for me. And the last thing that raises a flag for me is the whole question about the way that this officer has been identified. I keep hearing he's Somali American, he's Somali American. He's a police officer, he's American. I mean, when the crazy white man from wherever went and shot up the Republican baseball game, they didn't say a white boy shot up the baseball game. They said he was a shooter. You had to go 3-4 layers. So to identify him as a Somali is almost to begin to ratchet up some anti-Somali, anti-Muslim sentiment.
Okay, let me go
Can I
to...
step in here for a minute?
Yeah, sure, go
Can I
ahead.
step in here for a minute? You know, the person that's speaking right now, I'm always interested, and by the way, for full disclosure, I work all sides, plaintiff cases, prosecutorial, criminal defense, everything, okay? My advocacy is for facts and evidence, but when I hear inflammatory rhetoric from a person that has never done police work, probably never been even on a ride-along with the police...
You don't know anything about me, sir. You don't know where I've been. I have been on ride-alongs. How dare you assume anything about me? You're out of order. You're out of line. Whatever you do, you cannot assume.
Inflammatory comment about the Michael Brown shooting is forensically wrong. Okay, that was investigated by the United States Department of Justice and 2 other agencies, the Sheriff's
You are rhetorically out of order. You are rhetorically out of order.
All right.
And found to be a justifiable
Rhetorically out of order.
I myself did the forensic analysis independently on that
Well, that
shooting.
lets me know how reliable you are as a witness.
Okay, one moment. Ron, I just want to move on to Ray Baker. Ray, when you look at this case, is it being treated any differently from the hundreds of other shootings that we've seen in the country?
Undoubtedly it is. It should be, right? We have to be mature enough as citizens in the United States and members of a global community to be able to understand there are different nuances and specificities for each situation. Knowing that, we can identify what those things are that are different while also keeping in context what the larger point is saying. There is a problem with violence at large in the United States, particularly gun violence. The United States is a place that communicates through the language of violence whenever it has dissatisfaction politically, dissatisfaction economically, and various other ways. And our law enforcement make that even more problematic because they are now agents of the state. And so if we see disproportionately one group of Americans being killed by the agents of the state, it is reasonable to conclude then that that group of Americans feel as though the state is now against them. And what's happening here, though, many Americans, particularly black Americans, but allies of all walks of life, have been saying, listen, if police are coming and shooting African Americans at disproportionate rates, if there are incidences of citizen police engagement that is ending with violence and death to black Americans, it soon will happen to white Americans. Yes. And now that this is starting to happen, we see what we just mentioned with Prime Minister Turnbull making special demands for wanting to see justice. We see the largest national community wanting justice. And we should want justice, but it should not have to take this.